students at both the BA and MA levels. So I also want to say thank you to the students / photographers who participated in the project, because I think they responded really well to the brief in relation to some of the subjects and themes that we work with through the Berg Delier show, which is on exhibition downstairs. And I also want to say thank you to David for coming along and being part of the presentation tonight. So just a little bit of information on David Berg, just in case you don't know who he is. He's a photo artist and theorist. His books include the International Visual Work Zone, also Photography, Key Concepts, and Photography and Surrealism. His forthcoming works include collective visual works and essays on art photography. He is the course leader of the MA Photographic Studies program and professor of photography at the University of Westminster. Layal is a research and visiting lecturer at University of Westminster and SOAS. She's currently writing up her thesis titled Dismantling and Reproducing the Orientalist Canon, Neo-Orientalism in Contemporary Visual Arts. She's currently working on a book with Tariq Sabri titled Arab Subcultures, Transformations in Theory and Practice, and has recently published Rethinking Gender Studies towards an Arab Feminist Epistemology and Arab Cultural Studies, Mapping the Field. So thank you to everyone, and I'm going to hand over to Layal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for attending the event this evening. Again, I reciprocate the thanks to Iniva. Thank you very much for inviting us to take part in this public conversation, but also for providing the space for the students and alumni from the MA Photographic Studies to exhibit their work. Very big thanks, Teresa. The way that we will proceed is I'll speak a little bit about the exhibition, speak a little bit about the development of the thinking in terms of the concept, then move on to the students, the artists who also will be speaking about their work, briefly about their practice and how they responded to the exhibition, to Burak, Delier, and to On Borrowed Times. And then we'll open up the discussion with David as well, who will contribute with a few ideas on critical practice. The exhibition first is a response to Burak Delier's exhibition, which is showing at the main gallery space. Freedom has no speech, has no script. Sorry, but when we first invited to take part in this, unfortunately we had not seen his work, so we had only encountered the work through documentations and through his online website. So to some extent, there were some limitations around how to see his work, especially some of the site-specific nature as well. So, and also it was the first, Iniva is the first to exhibit his work, so it's the first exhibition he's having in the UK. But what we kind of gathered from a lot of his work is that he deals a lot with paradoxes, with contradictions, and with power dynamics at work in capitalism, and that is definitely manifested through the art world, corporate and consumer culture. So he's interested in the art world, consumer and corporate culture. But whilst we were kind of conceptually thinking of the exhibition, of our response, I read an article about a protest affiliated with Occupy Museum movement at the Guggenheim in New York. It was affiliated both with the Occupy Museum and the Gulf Labor. A group of 40 protesters, artists, professors, students, and activists unfurled banners, dropped leaflets, and chanted slogans. The protest, or as some of those participating named it as the intervention, was mobilized as a political gesture against global art market complicit in the exploitation of precarious labor. And here, of course, the main concern was the unjust labor conditions of workers building the Gulf, the franchise of Guggenheim at the Saadiyat Island in Abu Dhabi, in UAE. And many human rights organizations have actually visited the sites and have reported on some grueling and inhumane conditions that these workers have been subjected to on a daily basis. In a conversation with a colleague, and after reading the article, and there was also a YouTube video also of the recording by one of the attendees of the gallery at that time. It was at the Saturday lunchtime, I think, pay as you can. So there was a recording, and whilst looking at the recording, one could not but question given the art market's increasing interest in anti-capitalist art, of this action being received as yet another spectacle accommodated by the museum itself. And you see a lot of looks of confusion with these attending the exhibition, with the attendees, so there was lack of understanding what was going on. Although now this has been recurrent, so there was another protest, I think, approximately a week ago, and there's more of a kind of media coverage of the protests, but initially there was some sort of confusion. And this led me to kind of ask further questions. How do we think of activism within the context of the museum space, but also how do we think of political art as well? How can political art in a way escape its own spectacle? And can it survive the pressures of the art market and yet remain political? So before really speaking about unborrowed times, what we tried to kind of initiate through the exhibition, I'd like to speak about what it's not, and there's a limitation but also a risk to seeing the exhibition as an anti-capitalist exhibition. And I think to endow unborrowed times exhibition with the political project of anti-capitalism is to problematically claim that it has successfully made that leap from art as a spectacle of or against capitalism to art as a critical social engagement with the material conditions of life under capitalism. Now, the fact that the exhibition is held at Iniva definitely positions it in a different light. However, at the level of display, still the works are hung on the wall in a manner that reactivates a desire to spectate. The exhibition also includes work that overplay the spectacle of capital through appropriative practices, allegory, irony, and satire. Does this undermine its political underpinning? Does it risk echoing the same mechanisms through which the logic of commodity culture operates? Now, for an orthodox Marxist, anti-capitalist, and if that figure still exists, the answer most probably is a yes. This exhibition may signify the failure of the artist to take on the ethical position of a producer in a Benjaminian sense, to position himself on the side of the proletariat, and to adopt in his work, through his work, to account for the practices of exploitation. Now, if this imagined Marxist we're speaking about happens to be an Adornian, then the work ceases as well to be political. For the role of the artist is to prove, according to Adorno, is to produce a non-compromising art, one that resists commodification, consumption, and appropriation, and therefore secures its autonomy from the market. Many of the emerging artists contributing to this exhibition will more than happily sell their work, not the least to pay for the minimum cost of living, but also to pay back debts that incurred in paying for their education, especially with the increase in university fees post-British government's austerity measures. Now, of course, the model of the artist as producer, a la Benjamin, or the autonomous art, a la Adorno, have for long been debunked for several reasons, historical, economic, cultural, that are beyond the registers of this talk. 20 years ago, Hal Foster, writing on the concept of the political, very clearly points to the limitation of this productivist model, because of the fact that for its universalist conception of class struggle, and without kind of faffing around too much, one can critique this universal conception of class struggle by just thinking of the effects of the economic crisis on each and every one, which is very different. So this whole idea of a productivist model has been critiqued quite rigorously. Not only does this model also obliterates the centrality of the struggle at the level of representation and at the level of the cultural institution. For him, so in a way, by only following the productivist model, we're in some way we're obliterating those who are fighting to take part in the production of art, and in a way we are also obliterating the fact that we can intervene at the level of representation, and we can intervene at the level of signification, not only at the level of production. But also for him, the productivist model is limited in that it does not critically account for the significance of consumption, and here I can only think of Jan's series Belgravia, which is showing in the exhibition, but also on the consumption of significance. And here I could think of Wilk's T-shirt, the consumption of significance, which is consuming the work of Van Gogh through a T-shirt as well. That being said, this does not mean that critical practice need not account for the historical weight of capitalism or its submission of the human labor to the laws of market value. All the works exhibited do so, be it implicitly or explicitly. The intention in this exhibition was to open up a critical dialogue between capitalism's alluring facade and the record of broken promises ranging from economic collapse to environmental degradation. And finally, to refrain from positioning the diversity of critical practices, including in the exhibition, as anti-capitalist, is not a defeatist resignation. And here, not a helplessness in Latour's formulation. And all I can think of is a recent talk by Bruno Latour on the affects of capitalism, where he says, the affects of capitalism, that is, of thinking in terms of capitalism, is to generate, for most of people who don't benefit from its wealth, a feeling of helplessness. And for a few who benefit from its immense enthusiasm, together with the dumbness of the senses. And so this exhibition is more about exposing both this kind of helplessness that we're faced with, but also the dumbness of our senses that is in itself an effect of capitalism. Having said all of this, the question is yet to be resolved. How do artists escape the pressures of the market, of commodification of their work, without this at the same time remaining political? And are we, as indebted artists, excused if we find ourselves reproducing capitalism, even within limits, to secure that we repay back our debts? So that was just a little introduction, and then now we can move on to speaking to the artists.
Okay, so hi.
Maybe we could start first with Paula. Paula's work is in the winter holidays, yes, on the first page. Paula will speak about her work and her response to the exhibition. So if you can tell us a little bit more about your practice and how you responded conceptually to the exhibition.
Yeah. Okay, so hi, my name is Paula. I'm from Spain. I'm a student from the University of Westminster. This is an ongoing project that I've been shooting since 2011. It's shot in Andorra, which probably you all know, but it's a tiny country that's between the Spanish and the French frontier in the Pyrenees. When I was a kid, we used to go there once a year because my family is from the Basque Country, which is in northern Spain, and it's only a couple of hours away. And I hadn't been there for about 10 years, and when I came back in 2011, the landscape had completely transformed as the skiing and winter resorts had developed more and more. To my surprise, though, a lot of the structures that used to be there, that were mainly built in the 70s and the 80s, were not working but hadn't been removed. So the project depicts some of these structures, and what I think it operates in two different levels. In a way, I intended to sort of draw the attention of the environmental damage that's been produced by the unstoppable development of these skiing resorts throughout the Pyrenees, but also I wanted to share the strangeness that I find in this evolving landscape. When you're standing about 3,000 meters above the sea level and you confront these massive structures, it feels quite uncanny. And but I'm not sure. It's been quite difficult to try to show this in a bidimensional space that is the photograph, because the immensity that I physically experience in the landscape is very hard to communicate through a photograph. However, in any case, I think, like you were saying, and I think the rest of the work in the show also have this in common, is that I don't intend this work to be, a critic of the capitalist economy as such, but rather express what was happening there and offer, the possibility for the public as well to negotiate. I think, what's interesting about political art and the way it's been expressed nowadays, and I think some of the work in the show does it, is that it sort of like reveals the inconsistencies that we find in the consumer culture, rather than pointing into one concrete direction, and suggesting a critical response as well from the public. And that's how I'd like to think about my practice, and that's how, as a public, I think I also confronted the work of my colleagues in this show.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name's Will. My work's called 24 Hour News. It is a photograph, a grid of 24 photographs taken each hour at a certain point of a day's worth of Sky News. Underneath it is the captions of what was being spoken at the time. It's kind of broken down into a sort of checkerboard pattern between the news broadcast and the advertising that's broadcast in between. So in a way, I suppose the visual reference there is definitely, the sort of typologies of the Beshers, but it's obviously contrasting things rather than looking for similarities. I suppose the thing that I was most looking to highlight was the kind of, I think we're quite lucky we have quite a good press in this country by global standards, but I was just trying to highlight the kind of schism between these two different agendas, the news and then the advertising. If I was to think back to what probably first inspired me, it was actually, I think, a piece by Bill Hicks, if anyone remembers him. He's a great comedian, sadly dead, died very young. And he talks about, he goes, "Do you ever watch CNN for longer than, say, 20 hours in one day? I got to cut that out. Watch CNN, man. It's the most depressing thing you'll ever see. War, famine, death, AIDS, homeless, recession, depression, war, famine, death, AIDS. Over and over again. Then you look out of the window. Where's all this shit going on?" And I suppose that, which I probably heard when I was a teenager or something, first alerted me to the fact that there might be an agenda to what we take for granted on rolling news. I suppose a more critical analysis would be probably Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. He talks about the propaganda model as a sort of a way that, even though we aren't sort of, we see in the Leveson inquiry and everything else, there are kind of there is misconduct. We're not. The whole system itself is, in fact, because of the ownership of most media conglomerates, because of the way they source the news, because of the low-level pressure from advertisers, is colouring basically everything we see to an extent. And yeah, I guess with the work, I just wanted to sort of pick that out a little bit, but in a very sort of visual way. I think we sense it when we watch it, but this was a way of kind of flattening it, delineating it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Will, and my work is on the final page, I think. Yeah. It's the T-shirt. It's the only thing that isn't actually photography in the exhibition. And basically it's, I guess, really it's just a kind of personal response to a trip to the National Gallery and the National Gallery's gift shop. So yeah, I went to the National Gallery, and they have currently both of Van Gogh's sunflowers on display, and I was kind of just really interested in the first thing that struck me was just how, by putting them in a separate room, that changed them as objects. That was one of the first things that struck me, because I kind of skipped this long queue and went around and looked around at the rest and saw Van Gogh anyway. I didn't queue for 2 hours. And then the other thing that really struck me was that this queue that was kind of snaking back and forth, which took about 2 hours, as they were going back and forth, everyone was really slowly passing these huge posters of the sunflowers, very high res, and larger than the actual things. And it really kind of, that idea of auratic art, or the aura of the art object, kind of really struck me, that these people were kind of just walking back and forth past these big posters to go and see the exact same image. I understand that, but that's something that struck me. And then the other thing was that at the end, as I left, I kind of passed the gift shop, as you kind of have to, the way you're kind of forced to. And there was about maybe 20 or even 30 kind of objects in the gift shop which had been created specifically for this display of the sunflowers. So there was literally bars of soap, chocolate bars, umbrellas, and then this T-shirt as well. All with the sunflowers just reproduced and printed on everything. And what really struck me was that actually the gift shop is a kind of perfect example of the meeting between kind of high and low culture. So you go to the National Gallery to see these great works of art, but it's like, do they want you to leave with, how that art affected you, or do they want you to leave with the T-shirt that costs £18? So, and then the slogan that I kind of painted onto the T-shirt is that kind of idea of the kind of tourist art and tourism, and how the relationship between the two. But really, it's kind of about the idea not so much of the art as a piece of art as a commodity, but more of the artist as a brand, and the kind of myths and things that are kind of tied together between Van Gogh's life and Van Gogh's work, and how those are used to kind of create this brand that you can put onto anything and use to sell tat, basically. So yeah, I think the work is really a response to that idea of the artist as a brand, and also I think a little bit, because I think it was interesting that Paula was talking about how this has kind of affected her, that in a way as like young artists we have to think about how we envisage our career, and how we are going to even maybe sell ourselves as artists. And so I don't really, I'm doing a photography MA and I've nailed a T-shirt to a wall, so I don't really necessarily I don't really work in one medium or anything, so I don't know how I would brand myself, or how, and whether that's going to affect me as an artist or restrict me. So I think in a way I was thinking about that as well, because obviously we're having to think more and more about how we're going to kind of get by, and how we're going to sell ourselves, and you don't really want to sell yourself, so yeah, so it's kind of personal in that sense, maybe. But yeah, that's
Maria, please.
Hello, I'm Maria. My work is the diptychs, the portraits with text. It's a live user manual, which is a project talking about unwritten and underlying rules that eventually a lot of people give in to believe that we have to follow for some reason. It's basically a parody of a user manual that attempts to illustrate how we should live our lives in order to be safe, happy and successful. And it's combinations of portraits and texts in diptychs. The text is coming from advertising slogans that I found in London streets and in tube stations. The thing about advertisement is that I think that it uses a lot of ways to manipulate people's feelings, and a really common one is by increasing insecurity about something and then suggest an expert, which in that case is a company or a product, as a perfect solution for the problem. So I chose this kind of slogans because they had this effect on me. They made me doubt my life choices system, and they increased my insecurity about my judgment as well. So I chose them because I thought that this effect was quite interesting and strong. And I used them as a tool in order to create this short version of a life user manual, which will tell you how you should live your life away from danger. Because I wanted to comment that in the fact that I don't believe that there is a certain sequence of events that can guarantee you something as a result. The portraits, I chose the subjects for the portraits to be young people, because I think that this this is when people are for first time at that stage that they have to take all these kind of important choices, and they feel really nervous about them. And now I'm trying to expand it a little bit using also not only slogans from advertising but also warning signs and making a slide so that will seem like a full version of the user manual.
Xiaobo?
Okay, hi everyone, good evening. My name is Xiaobo Hu. I'm come from China. And first, please excuse me that I'm quite nervous and my English is not good, so I hope you can understand what I'm talking about. My work is titled Please Do Not Touch, and it's about the objects, the art pieces, and the historical relics in the British Museum. I found it quite interesting to look and think about these objects in the museum and how museum presenting them to visitors, because all these objects are taken away from their original culture, from China, Greece, and everywhere, and it's kind of cut the original context from its original culture and time, and put these objects in these new spaces in the British Museum. And for visitors, I think it's quite hard to see in the museum, in these empty spaces, how these objects function and their meanings in their origin time and environment. And for example, imagine that 5,000 years later in the future, here Iniva become a ruin and covered by mud and dust, and some archaeologists come here and do some field work, and maybe they dig out this very beautiful, well-designed and elegant projector there, and they decide they put this projector in the British Museum, if it still exists, and all people from the world come to see this project in the British Museum, and they are imagine how hard they can think and find out the function and how it works here in this institution. And what they see is only this very beautiful objects there. So I think because John Tapp in his book Ways of Seeing had some comment on this. He said something about that art is not about presenting things very clear. It's about mysterified because it helps the ruling class to legitimate their ruling roles. So I think art is never about the aesthetics. It's also about it's really about the power and the shifting of the power. I think in one of my pictures, the horse head here, it was a sculpture from ancient Greece, I think, in Parthenon Temple, and the Parthenon Temple was built, I think, for about 400 BC, and at that time, I think this sculpture represented the highest standard of art of the ancient Greek, and it also represented the power of the Asian Empire at that time. And I think in 1806, and a guy named Thomas Bruce, known as Lord Elgin, he got some permit to remove this sculpture, and the sculpture became his private property. And 6 years later, I think he went through some finance problems, and he decided to sold this sculpture to British government, and by about £35,000, and then the British government present this sculpture in the we see in the British Museum. So it's quite about the shifting of the power and how the institution and the private person to own this art piece and showing their wealth and power. So my work is basically come on this concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Iniva for enabling me to hear all these very nice discourses on photography. I always hear them in the university, so it's nice to hear you guys speak outside of it. And in a way, you've said so many things that I would want to talk about. It would almost seem a shame to carry on talking and actually better to have a conversation, but I will fulfill what I was asked to do and say something. But just to qualify, I'm not here to sort of speak on behalf of anyone else. I'm just here as another voice, so I'm not trying to speak about the work or anything. I just wanted to make a few remarks really about the idea of a critical practice in the context of the show, and also Layal's comments. I don't seem to have been able to avoid hearing people talk about capitalism ever since you mentioned that was the theme of it. Every time I turn the radio on, there's somebody talking about capitalism. And yesterday, I caught a conversation, which it turned out was on the radio, which was with David Harvey. And what I understood, this may not be exactly what he said, was that capitalism destroys culture, by which I would take to mean, if the simple economic definition of capitalism is the accumulation of wealth, that you kind of vacuum cleaner up anything that is worth anything for yourself. And these are held by a very small number of people in an economic sense. So that I think the statistics of the number of people who own sort of 80% of the world's wealth is, you can probably put in one room, or maybe a few more people, but not far off that. And of course, one can talk about that, the economic accumulation of capitalism, but the component of that I guess we're here to talk about as well, which is always in discussion, in dialogue with that, is the role of pictures and images. And photography, of course, is heavily implicated in this because it was born in the Industrial Revolution. It's part, if you like, of the Industrial Revolution. So if you think of industrialization as part of the process of capitalism, you may not choose to think of it like that, but if you do, then photography is inevitably part of the process of capitalism, because it's to do with the accumulation not of wealth in a specific economic sense of the picture, but in terms of accumulation of material that one negative can reproduce, mass reproduce, or one file now can be reproduced many times. So you can see how, in terms of the logic of industrialization and capitalism, these can go hand in hand. What strikes me about photography and capitalism in the 19th century is how far the use of photography, if we're thinking of it not specifically in relation to art, I mean that's a fairly particular story of another minority actually, in fact, in the 19th century. But if you think of the major uses of photography in the 19th century, they were predominantly by the state or by people to have themselves represented in photography studios. So you have these kind of, you have a popular dimension of photography, but you have a kind of state function of photography. So the military, very keen to use photography. The police, very keen to use portraits for recording criminals. Doctors and medical industries, very keen to use photography to accumulate archives of knowledge relating to that. Most of those pictures which are now circulate in the public sphere were, in a sense, very specific to those institutions, so that you can think about photography being kind of internal to the sort of state mechanisms. So the economic function of photography in capitalism in the state is to do with certain types of power, which you could call vertical. That is, that they're related to that particular institution. They didn't tend to go outside of it very much. Popular photography, and I'm sure you all know, everyone had themselves self-feed, basically, if you like to think of it like that. In the 19th century, you go to a portrait studio and so forth. So there's a kind of, petty high street market in a sense, and this doesn't strike me as being high capitalism in use of photography. And if you take that sort of mantra that capitalism destroys culture, you'd have to move forward, I think, quite a bit to the two periods when photography become really interesting historically, which is the 1920s and 30s, when photography is able to be reproduced fairly cheaply in publications, so newspapers, books, etc. And we have the beginnings of what we still live in a way, is a sort of modern culture of photography. And that, that's an amazingly interesting period. I'll come back to that in a second. The later period would be post-war, the 60s and 70s, where you have a kind of counterculture emerging, where photography is part of that, and it's spread out into everything pretty much. I mean, pop music, popular music, we call it. What do we call it? Beatles, all those people, the black musicians that were all involved, all of that. You can see photography not only involved in it as representing those people, but also part of that culture of an expansion of photography in a fairly heterogeneous way. So if you think, perhaps it's easiest to think about this, or it's for me anyway, through music, that if you think about music in the 60s and 70s, there is no central singular corporation who has control over the market, even though there are these massive companies, Parlophone and EMI and all of these people. It's actually fairly kind of spread out. And there's a sense that also relates to photography. There isn't a kind of homogenization of those industries at that time. And it strikes me that photography actually isn't quite being homogenized at that time. So you have a sense that it's still quite kind of open. So 1920s, 60s and 70s, and then I jump forward, this is a completely weird historical map, would be the advent of computers, where photography is in a sense completely transformed into being part of this machine in which we simply circulate data. And this is really, I think we might look back historically and think this is the most significant moment is the internet, because suddenly the verticality that I talked about in the 19th century, where photographs were linked quite specifically to specific institutions, suddenly this is collapsing. And of course there are many theorists who would also say that the models of the sort of panoptic society that people like Michel Foucault and so forth talk about, where people respect institutions, education, the police, etc., the family, are all highly respected, that these hierarchical institutions, patriarchal if you like, and so forth, are collapsing in terms of their authority. And we no longer look vertically, we look horizontally. And you can see this operating specifically in the relationship of images. The images no longer circulate within a particular institution, they circulate across them. And you can see that the internet as being a kind of transformative moment of that. So there's this sort of history that no one's written yet of the relationship of photography and capitalism that is related partly to the kind of economic models that capitalism has developed and evolved and so forth, but also the relationship of that or not to the images that are required for that particular model of capitalism. And it seems that if you look at that historical transformation, that images have become much more integrated and central to those models. to the contemporary model of nihilism, etc. That was just some sort of preliminary remarks. My second point, there are three, just to give you a time frame. The second one was more specifically this question of a critical practice. And I was rummaging around with some old books, and I came across this book on a stack, which is Walter Benjamin's Understanding Brecht. And I opened it with my bookmark in what was there, the author as producer, Walter Benjamin's essay. And since I was browsing through books, I had a quick look. And of course, this is a remarkable essay. The author as producer, which Layal was talking about, written in April 1934. It's almost an anniversary coming up. April the 27th, if you really want to celebrate in a Benjaminian way. And it was a talk written explicitly to give in Paris on that date, 1934. Remember, this is when Hitler comes to power. It was a talk given at the Institute for the Study of Fascism, which was basically, as far as I know, Walter Benjamin and about 5 people to kind of have this small, conference event to talk about how do we respond to fascism. This was the driving question behind that essay that he wrote. And it's sort of refreshing, it was kind of refreshing to go back to it. It's well known in photography. It's the first essay in that collection of photography theory essays called Thinking Photography. People don't usually read it, they skip on to the next one by Berg, but it's good to start with that one. He put it there for a reason. And his first question is, how does the progressive writer respond, to fascism? And we can add a whole list of other situations: a recession, a depression, neoliberalism, whatever theme it is, you could ask. How does the progressive writer respond? Okay, you could say artist or anyone involved in producing something. And he says, well, there are 2 options usually, and I'm going to try to jump from the 1930s to forward, but he says there are 2 options. One is that the artist thinks they're completely free and they should just do as they please. This is what he calls the bourgeois position. It's a normal position, if you like, of the artist thinking that they're free, they can do what they like, and I think you've fairly clearly indicated there are limits to that. And the alternative is that the progressive writer or artist will identify with those who are involved with the struggle that they're involved in. If you like, in the 1930s, this would be the workers, the proletarian. And actually, so if you're a progressive artist, and leftist in your position, in Benjamin's view, you would adopt the struggle of those that you're thinking about. So you simply kind of become one of them. He says this is usually called pursuing a commitment or a tendency. Of course, there's a strong analogy of that with the modern parlance of political correctness, that one should be kind of correct in one's position, right? This is a sort of modern version of that, if you like. So you have, on the one hand, you can do what you like. On the other hand, you should identify with this. You should be politically correct. This is the issues we're dealing with. You should make work that fits that. And then, Benjamin, very interestingly says, you have, on the one hand, the idea that the work should have quality, that is, the artist is concerned with their work. On the other hand, they should be concerned with the issues. And when you put this out into any forum, you then have a debate, which is, on the one hand, you should be committed, on the other hand, you should have good work, and this goes round and round and round, and it doesn't get anywhere, generates heat, and it's not very fruitful. And Benjamin it's interesting, he completely rejects this dichotomy, this idea. And he says, that idea of commitment, he says, is a kind of, he says frankly, it's useless. it ends up being a stereotype, if you like, a correct political tendency is the phrase he uses. It's very close to our modern correct political tendency. And then he goes on to say, I will quote, instead of asking what is the position of a work vis-a-vis the productive relations of its time, does it undermine those relations? Is it reactionary? Or does it aspire to overthrow them? Is it revolutionary? Instead of this question, it's quite often I read essays where somebody quotes this part, but they don't go on to read his critique of that opposition, which is, instead of this question, or at any rate before this question, I should like to propose a different one. What is its position within the relations of production? What is the position of the work that the artist is producing? Not the artist, but the work. And he makes a really important distinction here, of course. And I think this is the refusal to see this distinction is a real issue in contemporary ideas of political art, it seems to me. I mean, I'll give you an example of, I think, a political action by artists that is specific to the issue of art, which is the Sydney Biennale in Australia that was due to open last month, well, it did open last month, has for many years had sponsorship from a company called, I think is it Trans Am or Trans something or other, Australian company, dealt in all kinds of business, family owned, one of the chief executives, philanthropic, gave the money to support the Sydney Biennale. Australians are a bunch of meanies, no one else gives money to the arts, so they're very grateful. They're heavily dependent on one sponsor. They don't have big banks like the UK that can go to get money. 2 or 3 years ago, this company started getting involved in the business of stocking up the illegal immigrants into ships offshore. Australia has an awful policy. And there were several riots on these ships. Several people were killed, died in the process. And this company was sponsoring Sydney Festival, Biennale. Part of the festival is actually on an island off the coast of Sydney, which was used as a military base and then for some time as a prison camp. So it had a resonance of these sort of camps filled up with illegal immigrants in awful conditions. So quite a few of the artists withdrew their work. You know, they effectively went on strike. And in that sense, they were making a political action which was quite specific to the industry of art. Had nothing to do with their work, had to do with them taking a political action. Now that is an artist who's no longer an artist making political art. They're making a political, or taking a political position about art, which has got nothing to do with the actual work that they had, because most of the artists were not making, political art. They were simply protesting about being funded by this, and of course they got the guy to resign and so forth. So that's an example of artists making a political work, which is not specifically related to the argument that Benjamin's saying, which is that the position of the work itself, if you like, the critical position of the work, is the important thing. And he uses this word technique, which doesn't mean, filters on camera lenses or things like that. He's talking about the whole shebang, form and content, that in a sense that the position of the work vis-a-vis the existing photography, whether you're supplying the apparatus that already exists, whether it's art or some other industry, or whether you're actually making an intervention. And of course, famously in the 1920s and 30s, he explicitly names and critiques the work by Albert Rengger-Patch, his book called The World is Beautiful. And Benjamin's remarks about this new objectivity are completely scathing. He says, all the photographer can say about the world, it doesn't matter if it's a trash can, rubbish heap, or poverty, all he can say is the world is beautiful because these photographers have made it beautiful with their photography. So this is an example of what he calls modish photography, which is, in a way, supplying an apparatus. And here's a quote. Listen to this and think about contemporary culture. But he's written in 1934. He says, quote, "For it is an economic function of photography to supply the masses by modish processing with matter which previously eluded mass consumption. Spring, famous people, foreign countries." And he goes on with your list from CNN. Fantastic. And, you know, he has these wonderful remarks that a revolutionary artist is a traitor to their class. You would be a traitor to the tradition from which you're expected to join, so that you would not kind of create, in this modern context, museum photography, traditional museum photography. You would be trying to make an intervention into that, even if you were still trying to operate within it. So I think for me that's argument is a beautiful one, to think that it's a kind of issue about the position of the work, and that we should not confuse artists when they're being citizens and making political gestures, in the sense that if we all went out in the street and joined a protest, we would be citizens joining a protest, and not to confuse that. There may be times when these things are interconnected, but we shouldn't confuse that with the politics of the work. And I think that's a very important distinction that one always hears being jumbled up, because the position, the background of the photographer is invoked as a reason to reject the work. And I suppose that idea of critical practice is, in a sense, to create an interrogative approach to the making of photography. So you wouldn't say that being realist or anti-realist in your work was equivalent to being capitalist or anti-capitalist, because there may be certain problems or issues or themes that you're trying to deal with where realism actually is a requirement. I mean, if you're taking photographs of the concentration camps when they've been liberated, the last thing you want is someone trying to be artistic with the photographing of corpses, which you know very well are being photographed so that the people who did this can be prosecuted later, or Treblinka or any of the other wars in those cases. That the idea of photography as a documentary tool in that sense, with the high realism, would be absolutely essential to that project. So we shouldn't have a kind of essential idea that realism and anti-realism would be aligned with capitalism and anti-capitalism in that sense. So the question of what is a critical practice always has to be specific to the particular problematic or conditions that is being addressed. And that for me is why I so enjoyed hearing everyone, in a sense, initiate their own discourses around their work, because that's in a sense taking responsibility for the particular problems or issues that people are, or questions that people are interested in dealing with. So I should stop there, and then we can have a chat, hopefully.
Okay. Shall we open it to the public? Would you like to ask questions? Any questions, comments, observations?
Always takes a minute or two to adjust to the new dynamics, where we're suddenly not on the stage anymore. Unless you want to.
Well, I just wanted to ask a question actually about, you kind of went through this history from the early photographies onto the 1920s and 30s, which you said was an interesting period, and then moved on to kind of looking at the 60s and the 70s and more into now kind of computers and digital photography. And I was wondering whether the kind of the celebratory attitude you have now towards digital photography can to some extent parallel in terms of its political appeal and its democratization of photography to some extent, and it's becoming more or less of an everyday practice or everyday cultural practice that we all take on. Parallels to some extent, yet in two different historical moments. Benjamin's writing on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and the kind of the hopeful attitude and the hopeful kind of argument that he had on mechanical reproduction, and as well on the democratization of photography. I was wondering whether there's any parallels to that, and how does that as well affect the way that we kind of relate to photography within.
Yeah, I mean, actually I'd forgotten that in Author as Producer, he's very optimistic about ordinary people using photography. I think one has to maintain that optimism despite the depressing evidence to the contrary. Well,
but I mean, if we are to think about, I mean, in your piece, part of you speak about post-representational culture, and there's a worry about the kind of post-representation culture with thinking about more in terms of photography as pixels than through kind of signs that have meanings. And so can you please develop as well a little bit on that in relation to what you spoke about horizontality and perpendicular?
Well, very, very briefly, because I would hope it become a conversation that if you, this is rather crude, but if you contrast the 19th century photography enclosed in these institutions, they rarely left those institutions. The doctors who took pictures, in a sense, photography was part of the dynamics of those institutions, whether it's the police, whether it's the military or the army. They were kind of kept internal to those institutions. So the role of photography was integral to that institution. Now, all of those institutions have become, in a sense, almost completely invisible behind this sort of image world that we live in. And we don't know where images come from, or where they go, or what they mean, or how. So in a sense, the horizontality of that is very difficult to kind of deal with their belongingness. So that's my sense, that we have this sort of horizontal data space. And I mean, there are two things. One is there about a return to what seems to me like sort of a 1950s idea that it's a kind of modernist idea that digital photography is born in the computer. Therefore, if you take Clement Greenberg's argument for modernism, the logical place of photography as art is in the computer, or in the materiality of photography, which must be the pixels, or must be the materiality of that substance. So you can have an argument that this is post-representation, which is very sexy to say. We don't have to deal with all that clunky camera business anymore. And it's actually a regressive modernism to return photography to the surface appearance of the material, which is to wipe away all of these sort of questions and themes and issues which many of you guys are dealing with in very different ways. So there's sort of two things.
Well, thank you all for coming to the event today. Thanks to the artists, definitely, Maria, Grace, Will, and Paula, and David. Thank you very much.